In order to understand the great conversation of Western literature, one must begin with the Iliad. There are few other books that are as influential on the history that will follow as Homer's great tale of the Trojan War. However, in order to understand this story, you must realize that it begins in the middle of the story. Like many other epics, the Iliad begins with much having already transpired. So let me tell you the story that begins the story that we find in the Iliad. It all starts at the marriage of Peleus and Thetis. Now, the mortal man Peleus was marrying the goddess Thetis, and many of the gods and mortals had been invited and were expecting to have a most sumptuous and delightful feast. However, left off the invitation list was the goddess Strife. Of course, wanting to have a lovely party, she was left uninvited, and yet she took offense. So in order to put her special mark on this wedding, the goddess Strife took a golden apple and inscribed on that golden apple one little word. The word was Callisti. It means to the fairest. And as she threw this apple into the wedding feast, 3 goddesses figured that it must be for them. Well, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Hera, the wife of Zeus, and Aphrodite, the god of love, all claimed the apple for themselves. As a dispute arose, it was decided that there must be a contest that these 3 goddesses would enter into and decide, in fact, who was the fairest. There is only one man who is qualified to be judge of this contest and simple-minded enough to accept the request. And that was the most handsome man in the world, Paris. The 3 goddesses came to Paris and asked him to vote for them as the most beautiful. They each offered a bribe, or as you might call it, a gift, and Hera offered Paris power, Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, and Athena offered wisdom. Once again, Paris, being a simple fellow, asked for the most beautiful woman in the world. The only problem with that was that Aphrodite's gift was already married. Helen was married to Menelaus. Now, this did not deter Paris, and he went to the palace of Menelaus, pretending to be a visitor, and while he was there, he stole away the beautiful Helen. Menelaus, obviously being upset by the circumstance, goes to his brother Agamemnon and asks him to help him raise a whole host of Greeks to go to Troy and bring back his wife Helen. Agamemnon and Menelaus together go and gather the great commanders of the Greeks, Odysseus and Diomedes, Ajax, Nestor, and they gather together a great host, a huge army, and they enter their ships and begin to sail to Troy. After battling the Trojans for 8 years, the story that we find in the Iliad begins. The story begins because the Greeks had attacked a city and taken the daughter of the priest Chryses. Her name was Chryseis, and the priest Chryse prayed to the god Apollo that his daughter would be returned. Now, the Greeks did not want to return Chryseis, and so the priest Chryses prayed that Apollo would send a plague on them, and this he did. Many Greeks start to die, and under the pressure of this plague, they go to Agamemnon and force him to release Chryseis back to her father. And it's actually Achilles who recommends very fervently in the assembly that Agamemnon return this girl. Well, Agamemnon agrees, but on one condition, and that is that he will take Briseis from Achilles. Briseis is Achilles' prize, just as Chryseis was Agamemnon's. And so because Achilles suggested that Agamemnon would give up his prize, he takes Achilles in return. This is extraordinarily difficult for Achilles to endure because Achilles has come to this war looking for one thing: honor and glory. And when he has his prize stripped, his glory has been stripped. And so Achilles is very angry at Agamemnon. And this is increased by the situation that Achilles, in return for getting great glory, has agreed to living a short life. He has given up a long life to attain glory, and now Agamemnon takes that glory from him by removing his prize by Briseis. Achilles goes to his mother Thetis and requests that she would speak to Zeus and have the Greeks defeated on the field of battle to show how essential Achilles is to their army. After a long period of the Greeks being beaten on the field of battle, they actually come to Achilles with an embassy and offer him gifts if he will indeed return and fight with them against the Trojans. Well, this is not enough. He refuses the embassy and even speaks of going home the next day. However, his kind-hearted friend Patroclus has seen the carnage that has come on the field of battle, and being a good soldier, he cannot allow his comrades to be injured. And so Patroclus persuades Achilles to allow him to don his armor and to go into battle leading the Myrmidons. Well, Patroclus does precisely this and has a great moment of glory on the field of battle, and yet he is struck down by the great Trojan Hector. Patroclus is struck down, and Achilles, in grief, pulls his hair and pours ashes over his head. Achilles is brought to great grief, and though Achilles had sat in his tent before, soaking his grudges against Agamemnon, at this point he must re-enter the battle. And so Achilles does. He seeks vengeance by killing Hector, and so Achilles takes Hector's dead body and drags it around the city of Troy to show his triumph over his opponent Hector. Well, this is not the end of the story. And the story that we find in the Iliad is the story of Achilles' rage. This is the very first word in our story, and in order to finish this story, we need to have the completion of Achilles' rage. That occurs as Achilles puts his dear friend Patroclus' body onto the funeral pyre, and they go through the traditional funeral games. After this, we see the greatest moment of Achilles' reconciliation with his rage as King Priam of Troy requests that Achilles will give him Hector's body back. And though Achilles doesn't want to do any such thing, the gods come to Achilles and say he must. And so King Priam is given special divine escort into the camp of the Greeks, and he sits before Achilles, the man who killed his son, and requests that he have his body back. Achilles, looking at King Priam, is looking at the man whose son killed his best friend. And as Achilles and King Priam sit across from one another, these two very natural enemies, they put aside their hate, they put aside their vengeance, and together they weep over their common human griefs. And so we have the end of Achilles' rage. And that's the end of the story of the Iliad. Now, of course, you do have the story of the Trojan horse, which continues on with Odysseus' very clever scheme to get into the city of Troy and destroy it, but that's not in the Iliad. That's not the story. The story of the Iliad is Achilles' rage. Homer's Iliad is not just a plot line to be mastered or a list of characters whose roles must be memorized. The Iliad is a book, and books are read because words are beautiful. And Homer is a particularly beautiful author in that he has such an amazing ability to portray character. One of the common techniques that he uses in this is by contrasting various character types very closely to one another. One of his favorite character pairs that he contrasts continually throughout the story is that of the cowardly Paris to his courageous and somewhat overbearing older brother Hector. It is not difficult to see Paris as being cowardly. He is actually the one for whom this war is being fought. It is on behalf of his stealing of Menelaus' wife Helen and his ability to keep Helen in Troy that these armies must wage this war. And yet Paris himself is oftentimes very reluctant to be on those battle lines where his cause is being fought. This is a reason why many of the Trojans despise Paris, and his brother Hector does not mince any words in making sure that his own brother knows just how much he is despised and how far short his character falls. Seeing Paris, Hector raked his brother with insults, stinging taunts. "What on earth are you doing, and how wrong it is, this anger you keep smoldering in your heart. Look, your people are dying around the city, the steep walls, dying in arms, and all for you, the battle cries and the fighting flaring up around the citadel. You'd be the first to lash out at another anywhere you saw hanging back from this, this hateful war. Up with you before all Troy is torched to a cinder here and now." Well, Hector has laid some very strong accusations against his brother. And usually when accusations are leveled in Homer's story, the courageous will rebut them and prove them wrong. Paris does no such thing. And Paris, magnificent as a god, replied, "Ah, Hector, you criticize me fairly, yes. Nothing unfair beyond what I deserve. And so I will try to tell you something. Please bear with me. Hear me out. It's not so much from anger or outrage at our people that I keep to my room so long. I only wanted to plunge myself in grief. But just now my wife was bringing me round, her winning words urging me back to battle. And it strikes me, even now, as the better way. Victory shifts, you know, now one man, now another. So come wait while I get this war gear on, or you go on ahead and I will follow. I think I can overtake you." Paris makes up excuses for not going immediately into battle, and his promises to follow his brother into battle once he's gotten his grief worked through are less than believable. Also, Paris lies about the winning words that his wife has been giving him. Actually, his wife has just been upbraiding him for his cowardly character and says that she wishes that he would go fight so that he'd die. Helen carries no love for Paris. However, even Helen, as weak as her own character is, understands what a courageous man is. And at this point in the story, Helen actually addresses Hector and tells him that she wishes that she had a better man for a husband, looking right at him. Even though it's obvious that the world's most beautiful woman would like to have Hector for her husband, Hector will not give her the time of day. Hector is not a man who spends much time dealing with his own feelings, and the feelings that obviously this woman may engender in him are completely disregarded. After speaking to him in this fashion, Hector replies to Helen with absolute refusal. He says, turning to go, his helmet flashing, tall Hector answered, "Don't ask me to sit beside you here, Helen. Love me as you do, you can't persuade me now. No time to rest, my heart races to help our Trojans. They long for me sorely whenever I am gone. But rouse this fellow, won't you? Let him carry himself along as well, so he can overtake me before I leave the city, for I must go home to see my people first, to visit my own dear wife and baby son." Hector is a man who is completely solid. His character is not at all influenced by the interest of Helen, and that's because he does have those he loves, and he loves them very deeply. Hector loves Andromache and his son Astyanax, and we can see the basis for Hector's courage because he lives for something more than his own feelings. Hector dearly loves those who depend upon him, and he is willing to fight and die for them, giving up his own desires. There's a very lovely section that shows you the basis of Hector's character, and as he's going off to war, his wife brings their baby son to him. In the interchange between Hector, his wife, and their son, it becomes very easy to see why this man is so dearly loved and why he loves those who depend upon him so greatly, inspiring him that courage that gives him the ability to go into battle knowing that the cause for which he dies can very well be a noble one. Andromache brings him his son, and as Hector holds his son is actually afraid of him with his army gear on, and so he actually has to remove his helmet and then embraces his son very warmly. And the lovely thing that you see in this section also is the good wishes of Hector. Hector does not think about his own feelings like Paris, wanting to sit back and enjoy his grief for a while. Hector loves deeply those who depend upon him. And in this section, Hector actually gives up a prayer for his son, wishing that his son would grow to be greater than himself. The desire of any good father not being for his own glorification through the son, but for the son's glorification through his kind fathering. In the same breath, shining Hector reached down for his son, but the boy recoiled, cringing against his nurse's full breast, screaming out at the sight of his own father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling tears so it struck his eyes. And as his loving father laughed, his mother laughed as well. And glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, he kissed him, tossed him in his arms, lifting up a prayer to Zeus and the other deathless gods. Zeus, all you immortals, grant this boy my son may be like me, first in glory among the Trojans, strong and brave like me, and rule all Troy in power. And one day let them say, he is better man than his father. When he comes home from battle bearing the bloody gear of the mortal enemy he has killed in war, a joy to his mother's heart. Well, Andromache pleads with Hector not to go into battle. She knows that he will most likely go up against Achilles, and in fighting Achilles will himself be struck down. And when Andromache sees Hector struck down, she doesn't say, he is destroyed. She says, I am destroyed. For Andromache, her love is an all-consuming love. And when Hector dies, her life has been destroyed because there's no other life for her than life without him. This is the sort of devotion that a courageous man inspires in those who love him. Another contrast that Homer builds throughout the story is the contrast between the compassionate Patroclus and the wrath-filled Achilles. At the beginning of our story, Achilles does have Agamemnon treat him mercilessly. Achilles has had his prize Briseis stripped from him by Agamemnon. And by stripping Briseis from him, Agamemnon creates in Achilles such an anger that Achilles will indulge himself in that time-honored human tradition of the grudge. Well, Achilles will hold this grudge so fervently that he will make a tragic mistake that will lead to his own personal misfortune. Achilles will not help the Achaeans in battle, and he will even allow his own friend Patroclus to go into battle without his assistance. And when that happens, Patroclus dies. So because of Achilles' wrath, he commits a mistake that results in the death of his own best friend. As Achilles looks at this situation, he can only reflect upon the stupidity of his own wrath. In order to, once again, bring forward this character trait in Achilles, Homer will very clearly contrast a very merciful Patroclus with this wrath-filled Achilles. I would like to read a passage that shows this compassionate character of Patroclus. It comes from when Patroclus is visiting the commander's camp, and he comes across the warrior Eurypylus. And Eurypylus has been injured, and not only does Patroclus show him compassion, Patroclus will actually stop and bind his wounds. This begins with Eurypylus speaking to Patroclus. Struggling with his wound, Eurypylus answered, "No hope, Patroclus, prince, no bulwark left. They'll all be hurled back to the black ships, all of them. All our best in the old campaigns are laid up in the holes, they're hit by arrows, pierced by spears, brought down by Trojan hands, while the Trojan power keeps on rising, rising. Save me at least, take me back to my black ship, cut this shaft from my thigh, and the dark blood wash it out of the wound with clear, warm water." The brave son of Menoetius answered quickly, "Impossible, Eurypylus, hero, what shall we do? I am on my way with a message for Achilles, our great man of war, the plan that Nestor, Achaea's watch and ward, urged me to report. But I won't neglect you, even so, with such a wound." Embracing the captain, arm around his waist, he helped him toward his shelter. In aid saw them and put some ox hides down. Patroclus stretched him out and knelt with a knife and cut the sharp stabbing arrow out of Eurypylus' thigh and washed the wound clean of the dark running blood with clear, warm water. Pounding it in his palms, he crushed a bitter root and covered over the gash to kill his comrade's pain, a cure that fought off every kind of pain, and the wound dried and the flowing blood stopped. In contrast to that compassionate Patroclus, we see an Achilles who will actually mock Patroclus' grief as Patroclus comes back to Achilles' tent. He will actually treat Patroclus as if he is some child who has some sort of grief or wound that he just is too sad to be able to talk about. And Achilles will actually feign ignorance as to the cause of Patroclus' grief. And this is while most likely the screams of the dying Achaeans surround them on all sides. So they fought to the death around that benched beak ship, and Patroclus reached Achilles, his great commander, and wept warm tears like a dark spring running down some desolate rock face, its shaded currents flowing. And the brilliant runner Achilles saw him coming, filled with pity, and spoke out winged words. Why, in tears, Patroclus? Like a girl, a baby running after her mother, begging to be picked up, and she tugs her skirts, holding her back as she tries to hurry off, all tears fawning up at her, till she takes her in her arms. That's how you look, Patroclus, streaming live tears. But why? Some news from the Myrmidons, news for me, some message from Thea that you alone have heard. Tell me Menoetius, Actor's son, is still alive, and Peleus, Aeacus' son, lives on among his Myrmidons. If both our fathers had died, we'd have some cause for grief. Oh, or weeping over the Argives, are you? Ah, seen them die against the hollow ships, repaid for their offenses? Out with it now. Don't harbor it deep inside you. We must share it all. The extent of Achilles' mockery goes so far that you wonder why Patroclus doesn't run him through with his own sword right then and there. However, Patroclus completely brushes aside Achilles' mockery and continues to tell him of his compassion for the Achaeans. And Homer, in a moment of authorial sympathy, addresses this dear character in the second person. With a wrenching groan, you answered your friend, Patroclus, O my rider. Patroclus is the type of character that we as human beings respond to. He is kind, he is compassionate, and in contrast to the wrathful Achilles, we see just how vividly human compassion stands in opposition to our tendency to anger, our tendency to the grudge, and our ability to become so foolishly wrapped up in our conflicts that we make fatal mistakes. Homer is such an amazing author because even though he writes thousands of years ago, he still is able to portray human character in such a fashion that we can easily recognize the patterns that we experience in our own day-to-day lives. Homer, by presenting to us these various human characteristics, whether they be cowardice and courage, compassion or wrath, allows us to recognize them more clearly as we deal with them ourselves. And in so doing, we become more refined in our judgment of human character, and that leads us to the ability to use more fully what we call the image of God. In reading Homer, we're given a really good opportunity to reflect upon and more discerningly understand a very huge human experience. That is war. War continues to be a huge part of our human experience. And in reading Homer, we have a great opportunity to begin to understand that phenomena and to be able to reflect upon it well. At one point in the Iliad, the great warrior Ajax calls out as he goes into battle, "Bring up the joy of war." Now, as gruesome as it may sound, there are few things in human life that are as exhilarating as running into battle and having either swords or bullets whizzing around you, coming from men who are wielding guns and weapons who are just as intent on killing you as you are on them. There's nothing that can meet that sort of exhilaration and intensity in life. And actually, the Civil War General Robert E. Lee summed it up very well. He said, "It is well that war is so terrible, lest we should grow too fond of it." War is a tremendously engaging human experience, and we find ourselves very attracted to it. On the other hand, war is a great grief. War will make our lives miserable, and every time someone dies on the field of battle, it is a son, often a father, a husband, someone whose life will leave a very large hole in the fabric of our social lives. Homer also shows us the grief of war. At the end of the Iliad, the fact that King Priam and Achilles will sit together in Achilles' tent and weep over their common griefs brought upon them both by this one same war shows that at the end of Homer's Iliad, in a sense, compassion triumphs over vengeance, and human understanding prevails, even though these men have every reason to desire to kill one another rather than weeping together. Later, the Christian theologian Augustine will write in The City of God, "To carry on war and extend a kingdom over wholly subdued nations seems to bad men to be felicity, to good men necessity." You do need to reflect and think upon what a just war is. Why is war fought? And under what conditions is it a blessing rather than a curse? However, to do that well, you should reflect on the entire experience of war. And Homer presents that very well to you in the Iliad, both the grief of war and the exhilaration that it brings. And in so doing, you gain a good opportunity to become more discerning and more reflective, and in the end, show yourself a responsible user of that great gift, the image of God.